What is an army? Is it the thunder of its tanks, the roar of its artillery, or is it the idea of one? In 1944, the Allied High Command faced a brutal mathematical problem. They were planning the invasion of Europe, but they lacked the one thing every general craves: enough men. They were stretched thin. So a small group of brilliant, unorthodox minds proposed a radical solution. If they couldn't build a bigger army, they would build a ghost of one. This is not a metaphor. This is the true story of the 1,100 men who were ordered to fight a war of imagination. Their weapons were not bullets and bombs, but rubber, radiostatic, and pure, audacious theater. Their mission: to paint a target on their own backs, to convince the most formidable army in the world that they were 30,000 strong, and to survive the moment the enemy looked a little too close. The seeds of the Ghost Army were sown in the shifting sands of North Africa. In 1942, the British Eighth Army, under General Montgomery, pulled off one of the greatest deceptions of the Desert War, Operation Bertram. To mask their true intentions at the Battle of El Alamein, they created a masterpiece of military misdirection. They built fake supply dumps in the north, while expertly camouflaging real ones in the south. They constructed over 2,000 fake vehicles out of wood and canvas, while real tanks were disguised as harmless trucks. The German commander, the legendary Erwin Rommel, was completely fooled. The Allied victory at El Alamein was a turning point, and it proved unequivocally that on the modern battlefield, a clever illusion could be as devastating as a panzer division. Back in Washington, D.C., this lesson did not go unnoticed. In the labyrinthine corridors of the Pentagon, a most unusual officer took note. His name was Colonel Billy Harris. Harris wasn't a frontline commander. He was a planner, a strategist with a mind that worked in layers of deception. And he had an even more unusual collaborator, a theatrical designer named Ralph Ingersoll. Ingersoll had been a prominent newspaperman and a passionate advocate for strategic deception. Together, Harris and Ingersoll began to draft a proposal for a permanent, specialized deception unit, a traveling roadshow of war capable of performing for the most critical and dangerous audience imaginable, the German High Command. Their proposal landed on the desk of the Supreme Allied Commander himself, General Dwight Eisenhower. A man burdened with the knowledge of the terrible cost a direct assault on Fortress Europe would entail, immediately understood the potential. He gave his blessing. And so, on a classified order in early 1944, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was born. Its official cover was a Special Electronic and Camouflage Unit. Its real mission was so secret that even most of the men recruited for it had no idea what they were truly signing up for. The call went out, but not through normal military channels. The Army wasn't just looking for riflemen. It was scouring its ranks for a very specific type of soldier. They needed men who could think, create, and perform. The recruiters descended on art schools, advertising agencies, and film studios. They were looking for draftsmen, illustrators, set designers, and even cartoonists. One of the unit's founding members was a young Bill Blass, who would later become one of America's most famous fashion designers. Another was artist Ellsworth Kelly, whose post-war minimalist paintings would hang in museums worldwide. They were pulling men from the ranks who had skills the Army had never before valued in combat: the ability to draw, to paint, to act. But the Ghost Army needed more than just visual artists. It needed sound. The Army recruited engineers from the sound departments of Hollywood studios and from major radio networks like CBS and NBC. These men were experts in audio engineering, in creating believable worlds through sound. They would form the 31 30-second Signal Service Company Special, the sonic heart of the deception. And finally, they needed the voice. They needed radio operators, men who could mimic the distinct, frantic chatter of a full divisional headquarters, the traffic of orders, the casual banter, the mistakes in corrections that made a radio net sound authentic. These men from the Signal Corps were trained to become master impersonators, not of people, but of entire military formations. Imagine the scene at Camp Forest, Tennessee, where this bizarre unit first assembled. Here was a collection of soldiers who seemed to defy every military convention. They spent their days not on the rifle range, but sketching in notepads. They held rehearsals. They argued over perspective and acoustics. To any outsider, it looked like a boondoggle, a useless collection of artists playing at being soldiers. But they were, in fact, training for one of the most psychologically complex and dangerous missions of the entire war. They were learning to wield their greatest weapon, credibility. By the spring of 1944, the cast was assembled. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was a living, breathing contradiction. A military unit designed to avoid direct combat at all costs, yet one that would consistently be sent to the most vulnerable parts of the front. They had their artists, their sound engineers, their radio wizards. They had crates of inflatable tanks and trucks, rolls of canvas, and scripts for fake radio transmissions. They were a new kind of soldier for a new kind of warfare. As the real Allied armies, the genuine steel-fisted divisions, prepared to launch themselves at the beaches of Normandy, the Ghost Army prepared for a different kind of landing. They were not going to storm the shores. They were going to weave a story. And the entire success of the Allied invasion and the lives of thousands of their comrades would depend on whether the enemy believed their performance. The English Channel in late May 1944 was a churning gray artery of war. Amid the endless streams of troop ships and landing craft, one vessel stood out for its unusual cargo. The men of the 23rd Special Troops stood at the rails, not as hardened infantry, but as artists and technicians watching the coast of France approach. They landed at Utah Beach not on D-Day itself, but several weeks later, when the beachhead was still precarious and German shells still regularly found their mark. Their first sight of the war was not the grand battle they'd imagined, but the grim aftermath, the wrecked landing craft, the makeshift graves, and the exhausted 1,000-yard stares of the men who had survived the initial assault. They were entering a theater where the stakes were not critical reviews, but human lives. Their tools, paints, speakers, and rubber seemed absurdly inadequate against the concrete reality of German 88s and machine gun nests. Once established in a Normandy orchard, the unit unpacked its magical arsenal. The core of their visual deception was the inflatable tank, a detailed rubber replica of a Sherman tank. When fully inflated, it was a convincing silhouette from a few hundred yards away. But it was flimsy. A strong wind could knock it over, and a single bullet would reduce it to a flapping pile of rubber. To make the illusion hold, the artists went to work. They mixed paints to match the mud and grime of real vehicles. They stenciled on fake unit insignia and serial numbers. They even laid down tank tracks in the mud, using a special roller attached to a jeep, creating the perfect evidence of heavy armor movement. But a silent tank park was not believable. This is where the sound engineers took the stage. Their weapon was the sonic car, a truck fitted with massive speakers and a state-of-the-art wire recorder. This was cutting-edge technology, the precursor to the tape recorder. On these spools of wire, they had captured the sounds of actual tank battalions, the deep guttural roar of engines starting up, the clanking of treads, the shouted commands of crews. At night, they would position these trucks and blast the recordings across the countryside. To a German listening post a mile or two away, it was unmistakable. An armored division was moving into position. The final layer was the radio deception. The signal company set up a network of transmitters and began broadcasting with the volume and style of a full corps headquarters. They mimicked the fist, the distinctive tapping style of real enemy radio operators they had studied. They sent fake messages in a complex code they knew the Germans could break, detailing the arrival of the 6th Armored Division or the supply difficulties of the 30th Infantry Division. They created a rich, layered, and entirely fictional reality, all designed to be overheard. The Ghost Army was not acting alone. They were a single tactical instrument in the grandest strategic deception in history, Operation Fortitude. The Allied goal was to convince Hitler that the Normandy landings were merely a feint and that the real invasion, led by General George Patton, was coming at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point between England and France. While Fortitude used double agents and fake radio traffic from England, the 23rd's job was to make the threat feel immediate and tangible to the German commanders on the ground in France. Their first major test, codenamed Operation Brest, came in August 1944. The U.S. Third Army was breaking out of Normandy and needed to capture the critical port of Brest. The Ghost Army was given its most dangerous mission yet: impersonate the entire 6th Armored Division to pin down German forces in the area, preventing them from reinforcing Brest. For 8 tense days, the 1,100 men simulated the presence of 15,000. They laid down a blanket of fake radio traffic. They inflated their rubber tanks and artillery pieces in clear view of suspected German observation posts. Their sound trucks played the symphony of an armored division preparing for attack. They even had men drive in loops through local villages, their jeeps modified to look like heavy trucks from a distance, kicking up impressive clouds of dust. The deception was a stunning success. German intelligence maps, later captured, clearly showed the 6th Armored Division exactly where the Ghost Army had placed it. An entire German division remained in place, staring down a phantom army, while the real 6th Armored helped secure the Allied breakout. But this success came at a cost that couldn't be measured in rubber or radio waves. The men of the Ghost Army lived with a unique and constant strain. An infantryman knew where the enemy was, over there. A ghost soldier knew the enemy was everywhere, watching, listening, and that at any moment the illusion could shatter. A single curious German patrol, a low-flying reconnaissance plane getting too close, a local collaborator reporting the truth. Any of these could bring very real artillery fire down on their position. They were the ultimate target, designed to draw fire, yet they were utterly defenseless. Their only protection was the quality of their performance. This psychological pressure forged a unique bond among them. They were a band of brothers, yes, but unlike any other. Their shared experience was one of sustained, high-stakes pretense, a feeling of being naked on a stage with the lights blazing and a hostile critic waiting in the darkness with a gun. They had survived their first major performance, but the war was far from over, and their greatest, most dangerous acts were still to come. As autumn leaves began to fall across Europe in 1944, the Ghost Army faced its greatest challenge yet. The Allied advance was slowing at Germany's western border, facing the formidable Siegfried Line defenses. The stakes grew higher, the German defenders more desperate, and the margin for error vanished completely. It was in this pressure cooker environment that the 23rd would be called upon to perform their most audacious act of deception. No longer just supporting attacks, they would now be tasked with holding entire sections of the front line. Empty sections that the Germans had to believe were packed with Allied strength. The stage was set for what veterans would later call the masterpiece. In March 1945, with Allied forces preparing for the final push across the Rhine River, General Simpson's Ninth Army needed to concentrate its forces for a massive assault. This left a dangerous 15-mile gap in the lines near the German town of Viersen, a gap that, if discovered, would allow German forces to counterattack and potentially cripple the entire operation. The Ghost Army received its most critical mission: make the German High Command believe this 15-mile gap was occupied by the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions, over 30,000 real soldiers. The operation began on a moonless night. While the real division slipped away silently to the north, the ghosts moved in. They executed their most elaborate setup yet. They established not just one tank formation, but multiple convincing command posts. They deployed hundreds of inflatables, tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, positioned with meticulous attention to tactical realism. The artists worked tirelessly, using airbrushes to create realistic shadows and weather their fake vehicles to match the grimy, war-torn landscape. Meanwhile, the radio teams began their performance. They created two complete, distinct radio networks, perfectly mimicking the communication styles of both the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions. The airwaves crackled with fake messages about troop rotations, supply requests, and minor disciplinary issues, the mundane chatter of two massive divisions settling into defensive positions. The sound trucks, positioned at carefully calculated points, broadcast the sounds of construction, truck convoys, and soldiers digging fortifications. For 7 agonizing days, the 1,100 men of the 23rd were 2 infantry divisions. They maintained the illusion around the clock. Jeep patrols deliberately showed themselves in villages, their drivers wearing insignia of the fake divisions. Officers visited local cafes and made a point of being overheard complaining about their division's deployment. They created a living, breathing fiction right under the noses of some of Germany's most seasoned troops. The tension was unbearable. Every distant engine, every flare in the night sky could signal the end of the charade and the beginning of a massacre. The illusion's ultimate test came not from German technology, but from German infantry. A patrol from the 15th German Infantry Division, growing suspicious of the limited ground activity, began probing the ghost lines. They advanced to within 500 yards of the 23rd's positions. The Ghost Army had no heavy weapons to stop them. A single determined squad could have unraveled everything. What happened next became legend within the unit. Instead of retreating or revealing their weakness, the Ghost soldiers doubled down on their performance. A handful of men, armed only with rifles, deliberately advanced toward the German patrol, behaving with the confidence of an entire battalion behind them. They took up defensive positions with exaggerated visibility, signaling to the Germans that they were perfectly happy to engage. At the same time, the sound trucks nearby began playing recordings of tanks starting up and commanders shouting orders. The radio operators sent urgent but controlled messages about minor enemy contact and preparing counterattack forces. It was a breathtaking bluff. Faced with what appeared to be a confident, well-prepared defensive line, the German patrol withdrew. They had seen the tanks, heard the activity, and observed the unshaken confidence of the defenders. The intelligence they brought back confirmed to their commanders that the sector was indeed heavily defended. The Ghost Army had not just deceived from a distance, they had stared down the enemy and won. When the real offensive began, the 15-mile gap remained secure. Not a single German unit had moved through it. Post-war analysis of German records would reveal they had positioned 2 entire divisions to face the Ghost Army's fictional forces. The 23rd had successfully pinned down 60,000 real German soldiers with an army of rubber and imagination. Military historians would later estimate that this single operation saved between 15,000 and 30,000 Allied lives. They had proven that their unique form of warfare could not just support battles, but could shape the outcome of campaigns. The artists, designers, and radio operators had held the line against the Wehrmacht and won. But as the war in Europe entered its final weeks, a new question emerged. What would become of soldiers whose only weapon was a secret? On May 7, 1945, the guns fell silent across Europe. Victory was declared. For millions of soldiers, this meant celebration, homecoming, and parades. But for the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the end of the war marked the beginning of a different kind of mission: the silence. As their comrades celebrated, the Ghost Army received their final and perhaps most challenging order: forget. Forget the inflatable tanks that fooled panzer divisions. Forget the radio scripts that diverted entire armies. Forget the sound effects that held front lines. They were to pack their rubber armies and recorded sounds into crates and return to a world that would never know what they had done. The men returned home not as heroes with dramatic war stories, but as artists and engineers who had, according to their official records, performed camouflage duties. When friends and family asked what they did in the war, they had only vague, unsatisfying answers. I worked with inflatables, one might say. I was in radio communications, another would offer. Their true achievements, the lives they had saved, the battles they had won without firing a shot, remained locked behind the door of classification. This secrecy took a profound psychological toll. While other veterans could bond over shared combat experiences, the Ghost Army soldiers carried stories they couldn't tell, victories they couldn't claim. They attended reunions of their real divisions, the ones they had impersonated, listening to stories of battles they helped win but could never discuss. They watched history books being written that completely omitted their operations, knowing they held the missing pieces to crucial military campaigns. For some, this created a deep sense of isolation. a feeling that their unique contribution to the war effort would die with them. The very deception that had been their strength became their prison. The decades passed. The secret held through the Cold War, through Vietnam, through the fall of the Berlin Wall. It wasn't until 1985, 40 years after the war ended, that the first cracks in the wall of silence began to appear. The unit's official history, written shortly after the war, was declassified. A few veterans, now in their 60s and 70s, began tentatively sharing their stories. What began as whispers grew into a coordinated effort to have their achievements officially recognized. The fight for recognition was itself a battle, a bureaucratic war, fought in congressional offices and Pentagon hallways. The veterans gathered evidence, after-action reports, German intelligence maps that showed their fictional unit placements, personal diaries and photographs that had survived the decades. They worked to prove that their unconventional warfare wasn't just a sideshow, but had been crucial to Allied success. They argued that saving lives through deception was as honorable as winning through direct combat. The breakthrough came gradually. First, small exhibits in military museums. Then, features in historical journals. Finally, in 2022, nearly 80 years after their operations, the United States Congress passed legislation to award the Congressional Gold Medal to the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. It was the nation's highest civilian honor, a belated but powerful acknowledgment that their silent war had mattered. Today, the story of the Ghost Army stands as a testament to the power of creativity in conflict. They proved that warfare isn't just about superior force, but about superior imagination. Their techniques laid the groundwork for modern psychological operations and military deception. The inflatable tanks have been replaced by digital ghosts, electronic warfare, and cyber deception. But the principle remains the same. The best battle is sometimes the one you convince your enemy to fight in their mind. But beyond the military tactics, the true legacy of the Ghost Army is human. It's the story of 1,100 men who used their unique talents as artists, engineers, radio operators, and actors as weapons. Today, the Ghost Army stands as a testament to the power of creativity in conflict. They proved that warfare isn't just about superior force, but about superior imagination. Their techniques laid the groundwork for modern psychological operations and military deception. The inflatable tanks have been replaced by digital ghosts, electronic warfare, and cyber deception. But the principle remains the same. The best battle is sometimes the one you convince your enemy to fight in their mind. But beyond the military tactics, the true legacy of the Ghost Army is human. It's the story of 1,100 men who used their unique talents as artists, engineers, radio operators, and actors as weapons to save lives. They fought a war not with destruction, but with creation. They understood that sometimes the most powerful reality is the one you carefully, skillfully invent. And though history nearly forgot them, we now remember that in the grim, brutal arithmetic of war, these men added a miraculous, life-saving variable: the brilliant, courageous power of pretend.